All right, all right. Hello, everyone. Wow, just on time, 2:35, getting ready to start. And I've got good news. I've made things a little simpler today. Um, so Kim's chapter on machine functionalism is great. It's just quite uh analytical, right? You know Kim's style. Yeah, like Jack says in the chat, this chapter's a doozy. This lecture, however, will not be a doozy, okay? And the reason why is because this whole thing, functionalism, machine functionalism, the Turing test, the Chinese room, that's all kind of my well within my wheelhouse. And I'm not going to say that Kim does not do a bad job with any of this. It's just it's not the job that I would do. So I'm going to do this my way. So, it's important to have read the chapter to follow along with what we're saying, but I am really putting a different spin on it to try and make things a little more straightforward. Oh, there's a dog behind me. Hello, Tula. What are you doing up there? You're not a cat. This is my dog. For thinking she's a cat. But what are you gonna do? Okay. Let us get the slides going. So yeah, and I'll try and keep doing this. It's going to be a little tricky with the next chapter. I mean, if you thought this chapter was a doozy, the next one is a little like once we get into causal theoretical functionalism and mental causation, those chapters are quite dense. However, I will continue to attempt to really, really simplify things. Because like I said, Kim's work is good, but it's really if you're coming from a background like a very analytic background, or if you're somebody who's very into logic, you're going to like Kim's approach more than someone who's not. And Kim is very good at that kind of approach. Um, but admittedly, that sort of highly technical style is not for everyone. And as I've mentioned before, I'm really more of an ordinary language guy, that is just to say, as I've said here, everything's kind of loosely based on this chapter. I'm following the chapter much less closely, a sort of old school approach. What I mean by that is, I don't know if you guys have ever had a prof like this, but I had a philosophy prof who actually had a few different profs who would say, "This is the textbook. Go by the textbook. This is how we're going to cover it." And then they just kind of show up and talk. No PowerPoint slides, no handouts, very loosely based on the chapter. I'm kind of doing it old school like that today. So I'm going to talk a lot about machine functionalism, although I'm not going to stick too closely to the way Kim does it. And we're going to follow the direction of the chapter such that we end up discussing the Turing test and the Chinese room thought experiment, which is what I'd really like to spend most of our time on. Because I love thought experiments and I think they're a great way to um, get our thinking clear on certain topics, right? A thought experiment is an imaginary exercise that we undertake in order to clarify what we think about something. And we'll be doing that today with respect to, well, the question of whether machines can think, which is very pertinent to functionalism because functionalism says that the mind is a computer, a thinking machine. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Machine functionalism is due to Hilary Putnam, right here, who was an important philosopher, especially on the analytic side of things during the 20th century. And he made a lot of different contributions to philosophy, but also mathematics, um, or philosophy of mathematics, in addition to mind. A little bit of philosophy of science, and importantly, some philosophy of language as well. He's famously known, along with Saul Kripke, for his twin Earth thought experiment, which we didn't look at the modal argument against type physicalism last time, but if we had, we would have seen a little bit about um, a posteriori necessary truths. You know, statements like water is H2O. I mean, it's necessarily true, but it's a posteriori. Don't worry about this, okay? I'm not going to test you on it. But if you're a philosophy of language person and you take, for example, language and communication, you'll definitely learn about Kripke and Putnam and their whole twin Earth thought experiment. But what we're going to be focusing on here is his contributions to mind. Now, where he's starting from is the work of Alan Turing, and I'm kind of surprised that Kim spends so little time on this. Well, surprised. I don't know if surprised is the right word. I mean, I have taught this before, but it's like it baffles me every time how little Turing is discussed in this chapter. I would like to remedy that by telling you a little bit about Alan Turing the man, and about Turing machines, and about the Turing test. But it was because of Turing's formalization of cognition or a computation as rule-governed information processing, algorithmic information processing, that Putnam was able to do what he did. So we'll talk all about that shortly. But here's a little bit a different spin on it, a little bit of a different spin on all of this that I'm drawing primarily from Jose Luis Bermudez's book on cognitive science. Let's stipulate, hypothetically, that the mind is an information processing machine, like a computer. How should we understand it? We could, if we wanted to, look at how the machine is made, what it's made of, and what its physical operations are. Or we can look at how it does what it does, how the mind functions, what its functions are, and forget about the details, the implementational details. We could do that too. And that's kind of what functionalism does, takes the second approach. You know, if we were taking the first approach, that would be like studying the hardware of the mind, the brain, which is not, not something that we don't want to do. It's probably a good idea to look at the hardware. But to understand mentality, the functionalism claims, that is not strictly necessary. What we need to do is look at the software and keep in mind this mind to software analogy is not perfect. But what I mean by that is studying the mind as a formal system for thinking. Now, what do I mean by formal system? Something that Kim, that I will mention, that Kim mentions, is that when we're talking about formal systems, what we're talking about is something in the abstract. So when we say the mind is a formal system, we're not looking at the implementational details, brains, computer chips, what have you. No, we're looking at minds at an abstract level, a more abstract level, in terms of the functions that parts of the system carry out and what the whole system does, right? And a lot of cognitive scientists and philosophers as well take this approach today. In fact, as Kim is right to point out, Putnam's work, the introduction of the notion of multiple realizability, which we talked about last time, and his Turing machine functionalism, kind of spelled the end for type physicalism. And they've become the dominant way to understand the mind today in the cognitive sciences and in philosophy of mind. Nowadays, most philosophers of mind are functionalists of one kind or another. A lot of neuroscientists and psychologists are functionalists of one kind or another. So let's look more closely at these ideas. As I mentioned, on this approach, we study the mind as a formal system or a functional system. Again, what I mean by that is that we're abstracting away from the implementational details or the physical details and looking at the logical or functional relations between the states of the system, which could be a Turing machine, a human mind, whatever. In fact, Putnam thinks that we are probabilistic Turing machines. That's what the human mind is a probabilistic Turing machine. So we're looking at the mind in terms of what it does and how it does it, not necessarily in terms of physical structures, like neurons in the case of human brains or switches in the case of computer chips. I've made this calculator analogy before, right? I don't have my calculator handy, but you can have a pocket calculator, which is one way to implement a calculator, or a virtual calculator like the kind you'll find on your phone or your computer. Or you can have an abacus, right? There's any number of ways to make a calculator. But since we're talking about the mind and the basis of the mind is very arguably the brain, let's make an analogy with a natural machine. Again, this is following Jose Luis Bermudez in his really good cognitive science textbook. Think of a natural machine like the heart. What is it that makes something a heart? Is it what it's made of? Muscle cells and nerve cells? Does it depend in some important way on how many chambers it has? Well, not really. What makes something a heart is its function. That's what a functionalist would say. So the defining function, the defining characteristic of the organ that we call the heart is to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs and then circulate reoxygenated blood to the brain and the rest of the body. Doesn't matter what it's made of. What matters is the function that it fulfills. So if you're a functionalist, you can have any number of different kinds of implementations of a heart. You could have some kind of cybernetic artificial heart, right? And these are real. We have these we have implants like this, these sort of bionic hearts that we can transplant into patients, right? And they're artificial, but they do the same job as a natural heart. So it counts as a heart. Hearts from other creatures, like that of a blue whale, those are hearts, obviously, even though the blue whale's heart is massive. It's like the size of a Volkswagen van. You could walk through its chambers. Absolutely enormous. Or other creatures, a fish's heart, a reptile's heart. Both of these kinds of hearts have a different number of chambers than the human heart. We have 4. Some reptiles and fish have 2 or 3, depending on the species, if I'm not mistaken. But these are all hearts because of the function that they carry out. So that's multiple realizability that we mentioned in the last lecture and that we're expanding on here now. An important consequence of all of this is that these systems are multiply realizable. That is to say that we can implement a heart, a mind, whatever you want, with different physical stuff. Doesn't matter what it's made of, as long as it performs the right function. So, are we all clear on multiple realizability now? Very good. Jack says yes. One thing that I'll throw in here, which again, Kim doesn't really discuss, but I think it's a good thing to know about, are various levels of analysis within the cognitive sciences, which includes philosophy of mind, what we're doing here. So this whole idea of levels of analysis is due to a guy named David Marr, who wrote a book called Vision, which is about vision. In fact, it presents a computational theory of vision. Marr was a computational neuroscientist. And in this book, he outlines different levels of abstractness at which we could pitch our investigation of something, like vision or thinking in general. So the most, I guess we could say, abstract level of analysis is the computational level. That's where we specify what kind of inputs a system needs, what kind of outputs it produces, what its general purpose is. In the case of vision, for MAR, the idea is that we've got to go from the inputs, patterns of various wavelengths of light impacting the retina, to our output, which is a three-dimensional visual representation, like that we all have when we open our eyes and look around. So if we want to understand vision from the computational level, that's what we do. We specify our inputs and outputs and the computational task of the system. Then there's the algorithmic level, which is where we try and identify the actual information processing steps to get from the inputs to outputs. And finally, there's the implementational level, which is where we look at how something is physically realized. So if you want to think about what a functionalist is interested in, they want to understand a system. They're going to be looking at the computational and algorithmic levels of analysis. The physical implementation might be interesting to some functionalists, but the point is that you can realize a system using different kinds of physical stuff, and that's multiple realizability. So that's David Marr's sort of, it's come to be known as the tri-level hypothesis, even though it's not properly speaking a hypothesis. It's really just a description of different levels of abstractness toward which we can direct our investigation of some system. So the idea that we can have different stuff, if we look at a calculator and we take the implementational level of analysis, we're going to be looking at what it's made of. Is it implemented in software, hardware, or with bits of wood and beads and stuff, right? That's the implementational level, and that's where we can really appreciate the multiple realizability stuff. The algorithmic and computational levels are what the functionalist is really going to be interested in order to understand this cognitive system or that cognitive system, right? So that's a helpful little thing that I like to throw in there. That's good to know, the tri-level hypothesis. Now, one idea here that I think a lot of functionalists really gravitate towards is that if cognitive systems are indeed multiply realizable, it's actually a mistake to focus on the brain. We might then take certain brain structures that are just contingent upon evolution as essential in certain cognitive functions. This is the how and why of how and why machine functionalism brought down type physicalism. But that's not to say we should ignore the brain completely. In fact, some of the things that we've learned about the brain support functionalism. Brain structures like, okay, so for example, in humans, we have a neocortex, right? A new cortex. And in particular, the frontal part of the cortex, different structures in the frontal part of the cortex are important for things like cognitive control or executive function or directing attention, right? Things that we need in order to solve a puzzle, right? A puzzle like tic-tac-toe. So this is a toy example, but say you look at a human brain as she's playing a game of tic-tac-toe. You're like, oh, okay, the frontal cortex is really active there, so it must be involved. It must be necessary for the kinds of cognitive abilities one needs to play tic-tac-toe. But then I say, hang on, what about this creature? And I show you, say, a raven. This is because I saw a raven on the internet playing tic-tac-toe and winning. But ravens are very smart, right? So ravens can play tic-tac-toe. They can learn to play tic-tac-toe and solve, other little puzzles, right? But here's the thing, ravens are birds, and birds don't have a neocortex, right? So if we were just looking at human brains and we saw that the neocortex was employed when we solve puzzles or play simple games, we might think that it's essential for that kind of cognitive task. But it's not. It's just a contingent fact about the way our brains evolved. But other creatures can solve puzzles too. Creatures that don't have a neocortex, like corvids and parrots, for example. So that's what I mean by brain structures, just parts of the brain that are implicated in certain cognitive functions. Sorry if that was a very long-winded answer. Um, oh yeah, that I not surprising at all. I mean, crows are also corvids and they're quite intelligent. Um, and some crows have been observed doing very complicated things. I mean, crows and ravens both can solve puzzles. And the New Caledonian crows, a population of crows in New Caledonia, they've even been observed using tools, which is very cool. So they'll find themselves like a really good stick, and they'll kind of keep that stick, and that's their like insect fishing stick, and they'll use it to get bugs and maggots and stuff from inside holes. And they have to they takes a bit of practice, and the young crows aren't as good at identifying good sticks as the experienced crows are, which shows that there's like a learning trajectory there, which is really, really cool, right? Way better than these house sparrows that are always at my bird feeder eating all bird seed. Um, but anyway, sorry, I'm not a bird racist. I like all birds, but crows and ravens are my favorite because they're so smart. So, as I was saying, some of the things that we've learned about the brain actually support functionalism. So, yeah, if you're like a hardcore functionalist, you don't need to worry about the brain. But it turns out there are some interesting neuroscientific facts that support functionalism. Like, uh, well, we'll jump to the middle one, animal minds, right? Animals can reason in certain ways, they can feel pain and pleasure, but our brains are very different, as evidenced by, crows, great apes, octopus, cetaceans, right? So we have very different brains that evolved quite differently in some cases, but we have the same sorts of cognitive capacities, right? Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So he had a favorite tool, a clam smashing rock. That is
It
really cool.
it was actually kind of interesting too because it had like a little hole in it, like a little divot in it that obviously made it easier for her to hold on to it.
Wow.
And he would bring the clams over. This was in BC, and then grab the rock and smash it. And then he kept it in the one little spot and would come back to it.
That's amazing. Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's
So
cool.
cool. I've never seen something quite that sophisticated in it myself. Although one time I did see a crow wash something, which was fascinating. He had a little piece of food. It was just a walk a few weeks ago with my partner, actually. We were walking the dog, and this crow had a bit of food, and he took it over to a puddle, dropped it in a puddle, and like swished it around, and then took it out and ate it. And I thought, oh wow, that's really neat. But I've never seen a crow with a clam rock. So wow, that's really cool. You're lucky that you got to see that. Um, Neuroplasticity is another fact that supports functionalism as well. Oh, that's a good question, Taylor. So, is there any connection between physical structure and cognitive ability, like smaller brains are less able? Well, we know that when it comes to mammals, what matters is the size of the brain relative to the body, and also the size of certain areas of the brain. So, elephants have incredibly huge brains, but a lot of their neurons are in their cerebellum, which is cerebellum is from the Latin, which means little brain. And if you look at a brain, pretend my fist is a brain, then that little bit on the bottom out of the stripy bit out of which the spinal cord comes, that's the cerebellum. And what that does is help regulate motor commands from the motor cortex going out to the body. Damage to the cerebellum occurs in Parkinson's disease, for example, which is why those with Parkinson's kind of have those tremors and those jerky movements, right? Or sometimes stiff movements. It's because of what's going on in the cerebellum. So it depends on the size of different parts of the brain, but it also depends on the size of the brain relative to the body. All humans, most humans actually, have a pretty neat, pretty good brain body mass ratio, but sometimes you get like conditions, for example, like microcephaly, which means small skull. And so these folks will have smaller brains, and there is a cognitive impact. Like there's often some kind of cognitive deficit associated with that. So yeah, I would say but these are extraordinary cases, right? Um, in normal or I should say typical cases, you know, we all more or less have the same size of the brain relative to the size of our body. And there's been some weird science done here, like Albert Einstein's brain was preserved after he died because people thought, oh, he must have some kind of crazy brain because he was so smart or something. But yeah, nah, his brain's pretty average actually. Um, so I hope that answers the question. Um, Another thing is neuroplasticity. So you've probably all heard of neuroplasticity. That is the ability of the brain to kind of rewire and repair itself following injury. So, and this often happens. I mean, Phineas Gage, we've talked about Phineas Gage in this class before, who had the tamping iron blown through his skull. And of course, he was changed after that accident. But the fact that he was able to, continue on living means that there must have been some kind of healing happening up there. Um, a lot of people will perhaps lose certain abilities after a stroke. And then with therapy, uh, maybe physical therapy, occupational therapy, some kind of therapy, they can regain some of those lost abilities. And that's because the brain is rewiring itself. And that supports functionalism because here the brain is wired up differently than it was before, right? And neural reuse is very cool. It turns out that some parts of the brain that we thought were very specialized can be deployed in a number of different ways in a number of different cognitive tasks. My favorite example is the fusiform gyrus. So there's an area in the fusiform gyrus in the brain, which we call the fusiform face area. And it was thought that this was for recognizing faces, because faces of your conspecifics, of fellow humans, are important. But we actually use the fusiform face area for recognizing important patterns in other areas of expertise too. For example, if you look at highly skilled chess players, like grandmasters, um, their fusiform face area uh, seems to be implicated in identifying patterns on chessboards. So recognizing like, oh, this is move 20 from the last year's World Chess Championship. You know, who was that anyway? I think it was Ding Li Ren and Jan Nepomniachtchi. So say like a really good grandmaster, maybe someone in the chat knows. Yeah, Ding Li Ren. Yeah, he's the current one. Well, that's something that it's a good question, Jill. It's something that comes with practice, with expertise. So there are all kinds of examples, right? I have this neuroscience textbook that I use for my neuroscience course that I used to teach over in Cog Sci. And the examples listed there include an expert bird watcher, whose fusiform area seemed to be implicated in identifying different bird species. And when he had a stroke and damaged that area, he lost the ability to identify bird species as well as human faces. Um, Likewise, there was a farmer whose fusiform gyrus was implicated in his identifying of all of his individual cows, right? Um, so it definitely comes with expertise, right? Um, and people are even trained on this. The reason we know it's not one of the reasons we know it's not just for faces is because some neuroscientists did an experiment where they used these made up figures called greebles, which are just these made up figures with certain regularities. And they found that just with a little bit of training, ordinary people would employ their fusiform face area for identifying the like the families and the genders of these greebles. Um, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. So yes, it's definitely something that's developed. And sometimes there are even congenital problems with it, like certain forms of prosopagnosia, which is an inability to recognize faces. And that's, by the way, not an all or nothing thing. That can there can be degrees of that. I'm actually pretty bad at recognizing faces. This one time at the grocery store, um, I realized that there were these two ladies who used to work at the customer service desk, and probably for about a year, I thought they were the same person until I saw them there at the same time. And I realized, oh, they don't even look that similar now that I think about it. But I thought they were the same person until I saw them both there at the same time. So am I face blind? No. Am I bad at faces? Yes. Um, so you could think of this as a kind of weak functionalism, right? This whole idea that cognitive functions can be implemented in different in human brains versus non-human animal brains, or with different kinds of neural structures, or with rewired neural structures. We could think of this as weak functionalism, and the idea that the implementational details don't matter at all is strong functionalism. So if functionalism is true, what about machines? That's what we're interested in. Can machines think? Are we human beings who think? Are we also machines of a thinking kind? Um, let's look at some of the antecedents to functionalism, and then this is very different from Kim's approach. You know, Kim's approach, very straight up analytical philosophy, which is great, but I like to do a little bit of a historical approach sometimes. And here are some antecedents of functionalism that I've identified, in some of the in research I've done for some of the other courses that I've taught. Aristotle, all the way back in the day, writing in De Anima, or On the Soul, said, but since it is also a body of such and such a kind, namely having life, the body cannot be soul. The body is the subject or matter, not what is attributed to it. Hence, the soul must be a substance in the sense of the form of a natural body having life, this should say potentiality, within it. But substance is actuality, and thus the soul is the actuality of a body as above characterized. So Aristotle, and this all really has to do with a view he developed that's come to be known as hylomorphism, sort of matter formness. But for Aristotle, the soul was the form of a living body. Unlike Plato, who thought that the soul was, remember, we talked a little bit about the soul when we were looking at chapter 2, but we didn't go into too much detail. But we did mention that for Plato, who was a dualist, the soul is a spiritual substance, which is immortal, imperishable, divine, whereas the body is material and corruptible. Plato's dualism anticipates Descartes' substance dualism, and it's also heavily influenced Christianity and Islam as well. Not so much Judaism, but the other two big Abrahamic religions. And that's because, some of the early church fathers were Neoplatonist philosophers as well, like St. Augustine. Anyway, don't worry about that. For Aristotle, though, the soul was not some kind of immaterial spirit that inhabited the body. It was the form that gave the matter of the body life, its organization, its structure, all of the ways the body is organized in virtue of which it is alive. So that's pretty functionalist. So yeah, Aristotle anticipates that over 2,000 years ago. Amazing. And it's because he was so into vivisecting things, which is a little bit morbid, but vivisection is when you dissect an animal while it's still alive. So Aristotle, he's known as a philosopher, but he was also a zoologist, a biologist who studies animals. And one of the things he would do is vivisect creatures to see how they worked while they were still alive. Yeah, a little gross, but that's kind of where his view developed from. Another thinker who anticipates functionalism is Thomas Hobbes. So he opens his book Leviathan with the following. He says, "Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part where within. Why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have artificial life?" And Hobbes, in this book, he does something quite interesting. Leviathan is a political book. He wrote it to instruct the monarchists how to govern when he was living in exile during the English Civil War. But in order to make the case for his ideal state, he had to first describe the human being. And he describes the human being as this kind of natural machine, an automaton made by God, basically. But not just the body, also when it comes to thinking. Hobbes says that we are quite machine-like. For reason, in this sense, is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed upon, for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. I say marking them when we reckon by ourselves, and signifying when we demonstrate or approve our reckonings to other men. What Hobbes is saying there, what he means there, is that thinking is akin to calculating. When we calculate, though, we do it with numbers. But when we think, in the sense of, when we use reason, well, we do it with words and concepts. Very functionalist. And Hobbes is probably the first thinker, at least that I'm aware of, to liken thinking to what we would today call computation, right? And this is way back in like 16 whatever, right? So that's pretty cool. Another anticipator of functionalism is Julien Offray de la Mettrie, who was an 18th century physician, kind of like the anti-Descartes. I like to call him the anti-Descartes. Descartes says, well, the body is res extensa, it's like a machine, but the mind is not. The mind is thinking substance. But La Mettrie says, no, we're entirely machines. And he wrote a book called Man, a Machine, which is like a polemic sort of piece arguing against Descartes. La Mettrie said in that book that man's preeminent advantage is his organism, the way that we're organized. Why are humans so great? Well, we have a good brain and a good body. But we are animals. Lemaitre would say. We are animals. All animals, humans included, are like natural machines. And if humans are superior in some ways, that's just because of the advantages that our body's structure and organization provides us. But some animals are superior to humans, stronger, faster. That's because of the advantages of their organisms. And all of them, Lemaitre thought, have a soul and a share in the natural law, morality, to one extent or another. Yeah, Lemaitre is very interesting. Lemaitre, to my knowledge, was the first thinker to propose teaching an ape sign language. And this is all the way back in the 18th century, right? Lemaitre is like, okay, so apes can't talk, but maybe that's just because, you know, apes aren't good at talking, not because they lack reason. Maybe if we could teach them to make signs with their hands, which apes are very good with, maybe then we could talk to them and we could see that they have reason. And scientists did this in the 20th century, right? You've probably heard of a number of different examples. Coco the gorilla is a very famous one. Coco the gorilla could communicate with rudimentary sign language. Certain chimpanzees have also been trained in sign language. And of course, the this is an idea that we see employed, I think, really in a really neat way in all those Planet of the Apes movies as well. So, all right, how are we doing so far? I think we're pretty clear on functionalism, or we ought to be so far, right? Any questions at all before we get to machine functionalism proper? All right. Well then, formal systems. A little bit more about formal systems. Oh, question. Thomas says Coco could only talk in very rudimentary. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I don't want to oversell this, right? Coco kind of signed like you might expect a human child to communicate. And when we teach apes sign language, they don't communicate in as sophisticated a way as humans do, right? But they can learn some of those signs. And they can communicate in certain ways. One of the things, one of the limitations of ape signing is using things like a personal pronoun I, right? They don't really do that. Like Coco would sign Coco. Um, However, I think it's neat that Lemaitre poses this idea in the 18th century, and then years later we actually test it out and we see that there are chimpanzees and gorillas that can communicate to a limited extent using sign language. Very cool. So formal systems. Remember, formal systems are like abstract systems. And if you have um, a proper formal system like a logical calculus or a Turing machine, you have a system that is sound and complete. You have a system which uses symbols with which to express or represent meaning. Um, and we can create expressions out of those symbols, sentences, which state things. Then we can use these sentences to reason things out. The symbols don't matter because remember, we're talking functionalism, multiple realizability. The symbols are going to be some kind of physical pattern, but it doesn't matter what kind they are, right? In a computer, it's zeros and ones. And zeros and ones are represented by physical patterns, namely switches and circuits being off or on. If one is off, that represents 0, which represents a value of false. If it's on, that represents 1, which further represents the value true. And out of all of these switches, we can build up increasingly complicated expressions such that this computer can do all of the things that it does with zeros and ones. It's fascinating, really. So it doesn't matter. It could be other. We could have a computer made out of something else, right? We could have a computer made out of wheels and gears, like Babbage's analytical engine, which is mentioned by Kim in this chapter, right? Um, that would have been the first digital computer, actually, had Babbage finished building it, but he wasn't able to. However, when scientists in the 20th century built a version of it, it worked exactly the way Babbage had envisioned it working. So the first digital computer, had it been completed, would have been kind of like a steampunk kind of computer, which is pretty neat. So it doesn't matter zeros and ones, wheels and gears, whatever. It doesn't matter what the physical patterns are. What matters is what they mean, what they represent. So the semantics are what matter. So uh, and also the syntax, that is how each symbol or each string of symbols or each state that the machine is in is related to all of the other states that it can be in. So that's what matters. A Turing machine is a functional system. All of the states are defined by their functional roles. A Turing machine, we'll think of its states as logical or functional, and there are a finite number of states it can be in. Turing called them discrete state machines because there's a finite number of states the machine can be in, and it can only be in one state at a time. This is what makes them digital, right? But we can also physically realize these machines. So we can have a Turing machine that can be in a number of different physical states, and it's the same with human minds. Human minds correspond to the logical states of a Turing machine, and physiological states correspond to the physical states of the machine. And one thing that Kim emphasizes, I think, very nicely in this chapter is that even though it's the functional details that matter, um, the physical realization is still important in the sense that it provides the causal relations we need to hold between all of the different functional or logical states that the machine can be in. But you're probably like, whoa, 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 slow down. What the heck is a Turing machine anyway? And who the heck came up with Turing machines? Well, it was this guy, Alan Turing, who you've probably heard of. He was, I like to give some biographical details about Turing because he really is, I think, a supremely important figure who got such a raw deal. He was born in London in 1912 and he studied mathematics at Cambridge. Um, he would later go on to complete his doctorate at Princeton under the supervision of Alonzo Church. And he published a very influential paper on something called the halting problem. And that is where he outlines what a Turing machine is. And I'll tell you more about Turing machines shortly. During the Second World War, Turing worked at Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, which was part of Project Ultra. Project Ultra was the British intelligence code breaking effort during the Second World War. See, during that war, the Nazis would communicate secret messages to one another using a device that was called by the Allies the Enigma machine. And these machines were incredibly complicated. They looked kind of like typewriters, and you would type in your message, but the machine had a number of rotors that worked as ciphers. And it had like, there were different versions of this machine, but they'd have like 3, 4, 5 of these different rotary cipher things. Yeah, you're right, Nermit. A pretty cool movie with a really depressing. Is that The Imitation Game that you're talking about? That movie with Benedict Cumberbatch? Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that movie in a moment. I think it was on the whole pretty good. Let me I'll get back to it though. So you could set these machines and to scramble your messages, and then they'd be sent via wireless to, you know, wherever wherever they needed to be, and then they would be decoded using the ciphers, but the ciphers were regularly changed. So the average Enigma machine, you know, say I forget the number of rotors, say, you know, 4 or 5. There were like it would be set in one out of 150 million different possible ways. Impossible to figure out the ciphers if you're just a human. So what Turing did is he used designs for the Enigma machine that had been smuggled out of Poland by the Polish resistance. And he had those at Bletchley Park, and he was able to work out how to build a computer, which these computers were called bombs, that could work out the settings on the Enigma machines so that the Allies could read the Nazi communications. The extent of his contributions to this was not known until after his death, because all of this was like super classified. That's why it was called Project Ultra, because it was ultra secret information they were dealing with. But it's estimated that that Turing's work, along with his colleagues at Bletchley Park, might have shortened the war by 2 years and saved something like 14 million people. This is like Nobel Peace Prize stuff. I mean, maybe it's conceivable that Turing would have been eligible for something like that had this not been a freaking world war, and had he not been charged with gross indecency, which the movie covers, I think, pretty well. In 1952, he was charged and convicted with a crime at what at the time was a crime called gross indecency, um, which yeah, he does. Yeah, Jack, you're right. The Alan Turing Award is basically the Nobel Prize of computing. If you win the Alan Turing Award, that's the equivalent of winning the Nobel Prize for like a computer scientist or an AI guy. So he's charged with gross indecency because it was found out that he was having a relationship with this man, Arnold Murray, who had burgled his house. Yeah, Turing was a gay man at a time when it was still illegal in the United Kingdom to be gay. In fact, this charge of gross indecency was the same charge that was brought decades earlier against Oscar Wilde. And he was given a choice. He could go to prison, or he could be given this sort of estrogen therapy that would result in a kind of chemical castration. And he didn't want to go to prison, so he chose the latter. It resulted in changes in mood, changes in his physiology. You know, he grew breasts, lived a kind of isolated life, turned from computer science to things like computational biology. But in 1954, he was found dead. The story is that he may have committed suicide, which is plausible. I mean, heck, if what happened to Turing happened to me, um, it not to get dark, but I mean, yeah, suicide seems like a plausible explanation, but it's actually not 100. We're not actually 100% certain that that is what happened. It could have just as easily been an accident, because Turing did keep cyanide in his home, in his laboratory that he had at home. But in 2014, he was officially pardoned by Queen Elizabeth II, and now there is the Alan Turing Law, and it retroactively pardons men in England and Wales who were convicted for homosexual acts like Turing was. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me. I mean, this guy is a freaking hero. And he was just done dirty because he was different. And that really, you know, just it's just frankly tragic what happened to Turing. And the fact is that everything that we're doing right now, having this class online on this computer, all these things we have in our pockets, all of this is possible because of Turing. Um, so that's why I like to talk a little bit about Turing. I think it's important to know about his life and work. Um, and it's just such a tragedy what happened to him. Um, and the film, by the way, I think does a good job of preventing the broad strokes of the story, but it does kind of take some liberties, right? So one example from the Imitation Game that I can think of is the scene where they finally crack the code and they realize that there's an imminent attack on a convoy in the Pacific. And then Alan Turing, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is like, "Oh no, we can't tell them that we know because then we'll know then they'll know we've broken the code. So we can't radio the ship and let them know they're about to get attacked because then the Nazis will know we've broken their code." Um that is way above Turing's pay grade, right? That is not a decision that the people at Bletchley Park would have made. Um so there's that. Um Keira Knightley's character was based on a real person who worked at Bletchley Park, but the way she gets hired is kind of ridiculous in the film. Like, she gets hired because she's really good at doing those crossword puzzles. No, that is not how that happened. She was actually a university at a university, I forget which one, and a professor of hers was like, "I'm recommending you to go work at Bletchley Park because you're such a good mathematician." That's how she got that job, not because she was good at crossword puzzles. And I like Benedict Cumberbatch as an actor, but I the choice of portraying Turing the way he did was a bit weird. I mean, they kind of portray Turing as if he's got like super Asperger's or something, which, I mean, hey, very well he may have. Um, uh, you know, um, Turing is often, I think, identified by those in the neurodiversity movement, for example, as a potential historical figure with autism or on the autism spectrum. And I'm like, yeah, that's plausible, sure, but we don't know. And also, the way he was portrayed, it was almost a stereotype of those individuals. Um, Kind of like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, kind of a portrayal. And I didn't like that. I was like, yeah, Turing might have been a sort of Asperger's-esque sort of scientist, but it was almost like a caricature of that. Um, and I didn't like that about the movie, right? Yeah, he liked computers, must be autistic. Well, he formalized computation, which is, a thing that kind of an ASD kind of thing to do, but the way he's portrayed is as a stereotype, which uh like I'll put it this way, like, Turing was a peculiar guy. He would ride to Bletchley Park wearing a gas mask on his bicycle, um to avoid hay fever because he had severe allergies. He didn't seem to be aware of how this looked to other people, which, like, yeah, that okay, that sounds maybe like an autistic sort of trait, right? But the way he's portrayed in the film is kind of like, oh dear, oh, computers, kind of like a stereotype. But one thing we know for sure about Turing was that he was a gay man. Now, if we had portrayed Turing as some kind of very flamboyant homosexual character, like as a stereotype of a gay person, that would not have gone over well. Why is he being portrayed as a stereotype of an autistic person? Irrespective of whether he was on the spectrum or not, right? That's the problem I have with this portrayal in that movie. Um, but we don't need to get hung up on this. It's just a sort of like gripe that I have with the film. Even though I think, Cumberbatch he's a good actor. I think he does a good Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Benedict Cumberbatch, for goodness sake. We're here to talk about computation. And that is what Turing formalized. He formalized it using the notion of the algorithm. And the algorithm is a very old idea. It goes all the way back to an Arabic guy named Al-Khwarizmi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a mathematician who worked during the Islamic Golden Age and thought like, well, what if you could just have a sort of step-by-step procedure for solving different problems, and then you can, plug in your variables. That's an algorithm. That's today what we call an algorithm. So an algorithm is a step-by-step set of instructions for transforming a set of objects, as I say here, in a definite and circumscribed way. So he used the notion of the algorithm to formalize computation, and he did this while addressing something called the halting problem. And the question there is whether there's a procedure for determining whether a mathematical problem has a solution. And Turing thinks of computation as a very mechanical procedure. And today we call these devices that we're always on computers, but computer actually used to be a job description. It was something a human would do, and they would have a set of instructions, their program, and they were not allowed to deviate from the program at all. And so Turing takes this idea of an algorithm and says, like, well, we could get a machine to do what these people are doing. And we can use the notion of the algorithm and we can make it formal, make it abstract, such that the machine can just compute whatever we want it to compute. It can transform a set of inputs into a set of outputs in a rule-governed way. And I just think it's strange that Kim skips over all of this. That's the one. Yes, that's the one. I'm probably saying that wrong. Al-Khwarizmi, is that? So Halia, maybe you can help me pronounce this correctly because I'm not good at pronouncing it correctly, apparently.
Yeah, so it's Il-Khwarizmi. It's a pretty Arabic name, so
Yeah. Il
understandable.
Il-Khwarizmi.
Il-Khwarizmi, yeah.
Khwarizmi. Okay, yes, that's
Yes,
the
you got
one.
it correct.
So that's where the English algorithm comes from this guy who had this idea of like, well, what if we just specified a step-by-step mathematical procedure rather than doing everything over again every time we have a math problem? Why don't we just formalize it? And so that was a very important contribution to mathematics, and Turing uses that to make computation from a job turn it from a job that a human being does to a mechanical procedure that a machine does. Now, the machine in question is a Turing machine, which is an imaginary machine. This is what a Turing machine might look like if you built one, but you're never going to build one as described by Turing because they're imaginary machines. They don't need to be built. Think of them as like a mathematical machine. And a Turing machine has a tape with cells on it. It has a machine head. It can read what's on the cells. On the cells in the tape, there are going to be symbols, and the symbols mean things. Kim does this in the book with unitary notation, or unitary, I forget. But it's basically where everything's represented with the number 1. So if you want to represent the number 3, you just have 3 ones. And then 5 is 5 ones. And if you wanted to do 3 plus 5, it would be 111 plus 11111, right? And that would be 3 plus 5. So the machine head can read the symbols on the tape, and it can move the tape to the right or left. It can stamp a new cell onto the tape. It can delete a cell, and so on and so forth. We can see what it's doing with a display window, and we have a machine table which contains all the instructions for our machine. We'd call this a program today. And the machine table also describes every state the machine can be in as well. So I'm skipping over a lot of the examples that Kim gives. But, Turing machines are not as complicated as they seem to be, right? So, okay, be honest with me, everybody. When you were reading this chapter, I know Jack already said it was a doozy, but when you were reading this chapter and you were looking at those numbers on the tape and the machine tables, and you were like, were your brains melting a little bit? It's okay if they were. You can tell me. Yeah, Taylor, I don't blame you. It's a thick. Yeah, he did. Jack is right. Yeah. Taylor's right. It's a lot to get through. Jack says he spends a long time. Jack. So there's two Jacks. So Jack Reagan says yes, he spent a long time. Jack Yeager says I have some familiarity from Turing machines from computer science course. Yeah, it got progressively complicated. Maybe I can try and help. You know, um, let's open up that chapter and take a look. I'll try and clarify things. We won't go into super detail, but it's tricky stuff. This is like grad school math stuff. It's not easy. And I will go on record in saying that I am not a strong. I don't. I'm not. Mathematics is not my strength. Okay. Um, but let's go. So here's his description of the machine. So this is the stuff that people seem to find a bit tricky. Um, well, that's okay. We've had some history today, Taylor's, with the life and times of Turing, right? And the historical antecedents of functionalism. But this is simple. These scratch symbols just define the problem. This is the unitary notation. So this is what the machine does when it adds 3 plus 2. See, it just has this, and this. 3 plus 2, simple. That's the head. We want this to be our input, and we want to end up with this. And this table says everything that the machine will do. And this is a program. What you need to do to understand these is just understand. Think back to the David Marr levels of analysis. This is the input that we want to give the machine. This is the output that we want. This is the table that describes the behavior of the machine, the program of the machine. This is all this one machine, TM1, can ever do. Add 3 plus 5. So if we have a 1, then it's going to move, the machine head is going to move over to the left. And if we have a 1, okay, it's going to keep on moving. And if it runs into this addition symbol, which it eventually will, it's going to delete that and type in a 1. And then it's going to get to this 1. And then it's going to say, oh, I've got 5 1s because I've added 3 plus 5. And then it's going to put a little scratch symbol where this 1 was. And now we have 5 instead of 2 plus 3. And this table really is just giving instructions like, do this, go over here and type, and if there's a 1, move on. And if there's a plus sign, replace it with a 1. And if you have 1 too many 1s, replace it with scratch symbol and then stop. That's all this says. That's all it says. And it's just a way of describing the behavior of the machine. And there are other examples, right? Here's a subtraction one. It's and the reason why this is tricky is because it's abstract, and this is the formalization. This is the abstraction, right? So I'm not going to ask you to reproduce this. But I am going to emphasize that all you need to know when it comes to reading something like this is that okay, is that this is the input to the machine. This is the output. This determines how we get from input to output. That's it. That's all I want. That's the takeaway. That's the takeaway I want you to have. And that's why I don't spend too much time on on this, on the gritty details. I do in other courses sometimes, but Kim is already so formal with everything that I think what you need to know are not the fine details. What you need to know are the main themes of what a Turing machine does. Yeah, once we talk about the Chinese room, Jack, that will clarify things a bit. Let's see. We're on slide 22. How many slides do I have anyway? Slide 22 out of 42. Oh boy. Well, we better hurry if we want to get to these thought experiments. I'll tell you what, let's take a quick break and come back at 4. Does that sound good to everybody? I see Jacob nodding. Yes. Yeah, after Turing machines, it's kind of like, give me a break, man. Yep. Noah, Taylor, Thomas, everyone's like, yes, break. So we will break and we will reconvene at 4. And I'll remember to pause the recording this time so I don't have to edit a big, long, giant pause out of this video. But we'll go through the rest of the Turing machine stuff real quick, a little bit more functionalism. Then we'll talk about the Turing test in the Chinese room. Hopefully we get through it all. But if not, we'll keep talking about it because I think this stuff is so much fun. We'll keep talking about it next time. Anyway, see you guys in about 15 minutes. All right. Yeah, before we reconvene, I can answer that question, Taylor. A question about essay topics?
Yeah, so I wasn't here last week when you guys did the like brainstorming, so watched the video of it, and I wanted to ask if I could look at sort of like history of madness as well as like um certain like I wanted to talk more about like um cognitive issues that where like a person is separate from their minds or feels separate from their minds, so like intrusive thoughts and like the way that people like don't trust their mind. I'm still like developing this, but is that like a topic that I can like go into further and look around and brainstorm with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could definitely write on a topic like that as long as you make sure that it's connected to the themes of the class. So anything, anything to do with the philosophical side of things. If you wanted to do something on, I mean, I guess you could characterize that as something like philosophy of mental illness.
Yeah.
Yeah, which would absolutely be fine. Yeah, totally.
Cool. Okay, so I'll make sure to stay like connected to philosophy then. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so let's say a little bit about Turing machines here, a little bit more. An important thing to know is that the machine's behavior is deterministic. It's determined by what's on the tape, what the machine's current state is, the instructions in the machine table, and so forth. What this does for Turing is it gave him the mechanistic account of algorithmic information processing that he needed in order to address the halting problem. Now, we don't need to get bogged down in the details here, but Turing did incidentally prove that there was no solution to the halting problem. But more importantly, for our purposes, Turing was able to represent these machines as sequences of numbers. So he was actually able to prove things, mathematically prove things about the properties of these machines. So he was able to prove, for example, that while there's no solution to the halting problem, there is a special kind of Turing machine called a universal Turing machine that can run any specialized Turing machine. Now, we are probably probabilistic Turing machines if we are Turing machines. That's Putnam's contribution. So we're probably not determined like a classic Turing machine is. But one important takeaway from this is that this universal Turing machine is essentially the theoretical forerunner of the modern digital computer. So we'll skip this slide because I'm going to skip most everything on this slide in the interest of time, but because we don't have to be worried about the halting problem. But I'll just draw your attention to this bit on the bottom. What's really important for our purposes is that the work that Turing did provided the basis for our thinking of cognition, of thinking, as computation, as rule-governed information processing. Rule-governed in that they're algorithmically governed, right? Now, Putnam takes these insights from Turing and argues that minds are functional systems. Minds are probabilistic Turing machines, right? And what matters, remember, for Putnam, what matters, since he's a functionalist, is not how something is realized. What matters for him are what the relations are between states of the machine and what the machine does overall. We'll go back to our famous C-fiber example, which actually is due to Putnam. Kim uses it a lot, but it's something that goes back to Putnam. So if you're, say, some kind of physicalist, you're going to say that something like Josh is in pain and Josh's C fibers are firing are the same. For Putnam, what matters are the logical or functional relations within the system that we're dealing with. And as we've learned in other in some of our other lectures, creatures with very different physiologies from us, like aliens, for example, that have radically different physiologies, they don't have C fibers, right? Type physicalism would lead to a denial that they can experience pain because they don't have C fibers. But a functionalist would say C fibers are just one way that we can realize being in pain. So remember, he's criticizing type physicalism here. Mental states are a type of brain state. Being in pain is just C fibers firing. This is contrasted with token identity theory, where my mental state is a token of a type of a mental state. So my specific instance of C fibers firing is a type of mental state, being in pain. Your C fibers firing is a different token of that type, and some weird alien physiology causing them pain is another token of that type of mental state. But if you don't want to be a token identity theorist, you can be a functionalist, and you can appeal to multiple realizability to solve some of the problems that we identify in type physicalism. So I want to get to the imitation game because that's where the really interesting stuff is. Are we all clear on how the mind may be a probabilistic Turing machine? I'll summarize quickly here before we go on to the imitation game. But the basic idea is that just as, say I want to make a Turing machine that does arithmetic. Well, I can do that, and that's one way to implement a calculator. But as I've said many times before, I can also do it on one of these, or I could make myself an abacus and calculate on an abacus. Those are all multiple different ways of realizing a calculator. Now, the brain, Putnam is essentially saying, is a realization of a probabilistic Turing machine. And the mental states correspond to the logical or functional states in the machine. It doesn't matter that it's a brain and not a machine with a tape and a machine head and a machine table. Both are Turing machines, functionally speaking. That's Putnam's point. Now, the physical implementation, as Kim says, is important because it provides the causal relations that we need to hold. The fact that these different logical states in a machine are physically realized is what gives the system causal power, right? Does everybody understand what I mean by that? How about if you don't understand what I mean by that, go ahead. Okay, so it's like I can talk about logical states till the cows come home. But there's got to be a system upon which it's implemented, a brain, a computer, whatever. It's the physical realization that makes the magic happen. The fact that someone's microphone is on there. The fact that for example, my computer realizes its internal states in terms of circuits being on or off, switches being on or off, and those things can physically affect one another, is what allows for the realization of the logical or functional system. See what I mean? Because it's formal, right? It's in the abstract. It has to be made concrete by being implemented in something. So if I make a computer out of switches, or if I make a computer out of wheels and gears, or out of valves and pumps, what I need is for parts of the system that represent different things to be able to causally affect other parts of the system which represent other things. So it's the physical realization that imbues the system with causal powers, that allows it to be affected by inputs, to affect itself in order to compute outputs. That's what that means. There's actually a really interesting toy. I've been meaning to get my hands on one for a while, but you can Google this. I'll put it in the chat for everyone. It's called the Turing Tumble. So you can check this out later, but basically it's a toy where you make your own logic gates out of levers, and then you drop marbles down it, and you can make like an AND gate or an OR gate, or you can implement these different like logic gates, and the marble is the input and the output, and the way it drops through the physical mechanism is a way of implementing different logical relationships. So you can actually make a simple computer with this toy that you're dropping marbles down. So if any of you want to get your hands on that and mess around with it, that's quite helpful. I should get my hands on one for this class, actually. That would be quite helpful. But that's what allows it to work. I mean, yes, on multiple realizability, we can implement the same function using all kinds of different physical stuff, but it's the physical stuff that makes the system work. I guess that's what I'm trying to emphasize. Does that help make it clear? Well, hopefully, yeah. Okay, good. So Turing was really interested in this question, whether machines can think. And he proposed the imitation game to really replace this question, which he thought of as sort of a question that we're never going to answer with debate and definition and so forth. In fact, he says that this question is too meaningless to deserve discussion. So he operationalizes intelligence using the imitation game, or what we now call the Turing test. Operationalism, you can think of as making something unmeasurable measurable by focusing on something that we can observe, rather than the unmeasurable thing that we can't observe. Behaviorists did this by looking at behavior, right? Behaviorists operationalized the mental in terms of behavior. Turing operationalizes the mental in terms of verbal behavior. So why? Well, if we try and define machine, thinking, etc., we're never going to agree on anything, Turing thought. So why don't we see if a machine can do something that we all agree things that think can do? And that is hold an intelligent conversation. So if a machine can hold a conversation and the person who's speaking with the machine cannot tell whether they're talking to a computer or to a human, then the machine passes the test. In the original version of the game, there are 3 players. We have a man, a woman, and an interrogator. Doesn't matter what gender the interrogator is. So we'll call the man A, the woman B, and the interrogator C. Now, C's job is to ask A and B questions, and C has to try and tell which is the man and which is the woman. But C can't see or hear the people that they're talking to. They ask questions via like a teletypewriter. Now, A, the man, he's trying to fool C into making the wrong guess, so he's giving misleading answers. And B is trying to help C guess correctly, so she's providing truthful answers. And Turing then asks, what happens if a machine takes the place of a man in the game? Later, he simplifies it. Instead of 3 players, it's 2. One could be a human or a machine, and the other one is the interrogator, who's always human. And the interrogator has to ask the player questions in a viva voce examination, an examination in living voice. The kind of thing you do, have you ever done like a class presentation and then the class asks you questions afterwards to see if you really understand what you've just presented on? That's the kind of thing Turing has in mind. Or some of you will go on to do graduate school, perhaps, and you'll write a thesis and you'll have to have an oral defense where a bunch of professors will get together and ask you questions about your work to make sure that you really understand what you claim to understand. That is a viva voce examination. In fact, in the United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken, they still call your master's or PhD defense in some universities, they'll still call it your viva, your living voice examination. So the idea is you do this with a machine, and if you can't tell whether you're talking to a machine or a human, then the machine, Turing says, whatever it's doing, it's got to be thinking, because it's doing something that we all agree thinking things can do, hold a conversation. And it's this later formulation that we usually think of when we hear the term Turing test, right? Now, this is a little self-indulgent, so please forgive me. But this next point is actually from my PhD thesis. Something that I don't think is made clear enough about Turing's work is that you can think of it as a thought experiment or as an empirical experiment. And Turing is actually, he kind of flip-flops between both uses of the test. In some cases, he talks about it as if it is a thought experiment, pretty straightforwardly. Oh, that's awesome. Why can't we do that here? In Sweden, you get a sword after you get your PhD. That's pretty cool. I want a sword. Well, I guess you can't win them all. So a thought experiment, remember, these are imaginary scenarios that are directed at clarifying our intuitions or our beliefs about something. Oh, so Hyla asks, shouldn't he use the same typewritten message, not voice? Yes. Well, viva voce refers to the style of questioning, but it's all done via teletypewritten messages. The idea is that you're not supposed to be able to see or hear or sense, who or what you're talking to. But the style is in that of something like a thesis defense. It's also a parlor game that people used to play back in the day, before we had television and radio and stuff, and people had to entertain themselves. They would play Viva Voce, where, it's kind of like that party game you might play today, where you get a person and you stick it on your forehead, and so everyone else can see who you are, but you don't know who you are. So you have to ask the other people questions, and they tell you about the person who's stuck on your forehead, and you have to guess who you are. It's kind of like that. Oh, Finland. Oh, it's in Finland, not Sweden. Well, that's still pretty cool. I wonder why they do that. There must be some interesting tradition behind that. Or interesting reason behind that tradition. Okay, so if the Turing test is a thought experiment, which is the way we're thinking about it here, then it works like a conceivability argument. And Turing, again, you know, in certain spots, he discusses the test as if it's to be used this way. He asks, for example, in his paper on computing machinery and intelligence, whether there are imaginable digital computers which would do well in the imitation game. So, you know, is it conceivable to you that a digital computer, if it were suitably programmed, could convince someone it's a human rather than a computer by having a conversation with them? That's a conceivability argument or a thought experiment. And some people would say, no, that doesn't make sense to me. Like John Searle, who we'll meet in a moment, will say, well, you know, you can have a digital computer holding a conversation, but it's, you know, it's either not conceivable that ought to be treated as thought, or it's just not it's conceivable that such a machine could do that, could hold a conversation. Elsewhere, Turing talks about his test as if it is an empirical test, you know, as if we're actually testing a machine to see if it passes the test. Right. He wrote in the same paper that I mentioned a moment ago that in about 50 years' time, it will be possible to program computers with a storage capacity of about 10 to the 9th power to make them play the imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than a 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning. So this is like a test of whether a particular machine can think. And incidentally, a paper was just published out of UC San Diego, I believe, that submitted ChatGPT to the Turing test. And apparently GPT passes the test. I don't think this is actually the best use of the test. I'll just come out and say it. The Turing test is great if I think the use of the Turing test needs to shift from either a thought experiment or an empirical test of machines to an experimental vehicle for understanding why humans attribute intelligence or other mental states to machines, which is quite different from the way Turing envisions it being used. But that's what I think needs to happen. And that's effectively what my PhD research was about using it to look not at machines, but about how humans understand the machines that they interact with. Well, that's a good question, Jacob. If AI is going too fast for us to regulate properly, certainly we're trying to regulate it. So the European Union has passed legislation on the ethical use of AI, governing the use of AI to make sure that it's ethical, which I think is a good step in the right direction. And here in Canada, the federal government is gathering signatories onto a sort of AI policy, a policy for the ethical use of AI, and they're getting like companies and researchers and stuff to sign on to that. And I think that is probably what we need to be doing. It's not because I think AI is going to kill us all, but AI is going to make everything kind of suck when it doesn't have to. I mean, we're doing it wrong. So Taylor's suspicious, like, okay, so yeah, like this scientist says that the first robot that learns autonomy will not tell us it has it. Yeah, maybe. The problem I see with AI is that it's not being used the right way. Yeah, Jack, that's kind of what I mean, like what generative AI has done to art. I mean, generative AI like DALL-E or whatever, you know, it's trained on the work of other artists. They're not given credit for the artwork that these devices produce. And they can pump out what is essentially just AI generated garbage supplanting, you know, artists who are actually doing meaningful art. Yeah, Jack, that's a good point too. Making the internet less viable as a source of information. Yeah, like, so I don't go on Facebook very often, but I went on Facebook the other day just to see what's up. And man, I thought the place had gone downhill before, but holy moly, it has reached new levels of terribleness. There's so much AI generated stuff that's just pumped out so that it goes viral to generate ad revenue. As Jacob says, phone scams, absolutely, because we can generate voices. Like, I could train an AI on like somebody's family member's voice and use that to scam them, right? Yeah, Thomas, that's a good point. Some artists did do art and have now jumped ship to AI. Yeah, Taylor, it's a good place. It's a good way to put it. We won't bring out the worst in robots. They'll bring out the worst in us, Taylor says. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jack, good point. More useful to malicious agents than anything positive. And as so that was Jack Yeager. And as Jack Reagan says to what Thomas said, there have been a few cases of AI use amongst comic book artists. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like that. I mean, I don't think it's not like there aren't ways to use this properly. So in the second what was that other Spider-Verse movie? There was the first there was is it was it Across the Spider-Verse? The sequel, you know, the Spider-Man movie, the animated one. Yeah, so I think it was Across the Spider-Verse or into across. Anyway, they used AI to help with some of the animation, but the AI was only trained on what the animators were producing for the purposes of the film. And the artists were okay with that by and large. Like, that's using it as a tool to help the artist, but using it to generate art is just awful. You know, and why are we doing this? We should be paying artists, human artists, to make art. You know, AI was supposed to free us, okay? AI is supposed to free us along with other technology, and this is not the way it usually goes, right? But technology in general and AI is the big example right now, is supposed to free us from the drudgery, from the menial labor, so that we can actualize ourselves as human beings. It's kind of like the Star Trek future, you know, that you get in the Star Trek franchise. Everybody's material needs are met, so you can go and do whatever you want. You can go be in Starfleet and go flying around in space. Or you can be an artist or a journalist or a chef. I always liked in in like Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Captain Sisko's dad runs a restaurant in Louisiana. Why? Because that's what he wants to do. He just has a restaurant. That's it. Makes food. You come in. Hey, I'll make you some food. He just does it because he can. Like, and that's what technology is supposed to do for us, but it's not doing that. I guess in a way it's freeing us from our job. But what I mean, not nah, I mean, like, it is and it isn't. I mean, there are a lot of examples where technology is supposed to free up our time, but really what we end up doing is just using that time to do more work. Um, yeah, yeah, email, exactly. Like, now I can communicate instantly with people all over the world. Great. Well, that means I have to spend more time answering emails, you know? So Hyla says we still say that AI isn't intelligent because they can't actually think. Yeah, that's what somebody like John Searle is going to say. Yeah, yeah, robots were used in COVID. Yeah, that's true. They were used for cleaning. But again, what often ends up happening is that um we are we don't we don't get the time that the technology frees up for ourselves. It just goes to doing more work. Like, and I'm gonna sound real cynical here, but it's kind of like it's a trick that capitalism plays on us, right? Like, oh, this new technology, it's gonna make our lives easier. But really what it does is just allow us to get more work done. So, the people who benefit ultimately from this are those big giant billion-dollar tech companies and not the average person. But anyway, I guess the moral of the story is don't, you know, don't be afraid of AI because it's going to rebel and kill all humans. Be afraid of AI because it's going to uh because it's not actually going to make your life any better. At least not the way we're using it. Does like Google does. Say you look up Apollo, most of your hits will be about the movie or cartoon. Yeah, yeah. Well, Google's AI has made its search absolutely awful. I remember when Google was good. A lot of their search features have been removed, and now they have Gemini. Um, it's just terrible. Like, and the resources. Tula, stop barking. The resources that we're pouring into this. Like, to run these systems like ChatGPT, we need these giant server farms that suck up all this electricity. It stop. Like, why are we doing this? Like, stop. Nobody wants this. Well, I still use Google. It's just crappier than it was back in my day. Yeah, Noah, good point. Yeah, ChatGPT, GPT-4 uses a voice that's uncannily similar to Scarlett Johansson in the movie Her, to the point where, and Scarlett Johansson, she put out a press release about this. She said, something to the effect of, they asked me if they could use my voice. I said no, and then they went ahead and used a voice that just sounds like me. Like, it's wrong. It's wrong. Tula, come here. Sorry, my dog's barking. I hope you can't hear it. Okay. Well, let's enough of the doom and gloom. Um, Come here, Tula. Come here. Come here, Toots. I think she's barking at all those children outside. Anyway, there's some really interesting similarities between the test that Turing proposes and something that Descartes proposed back in the Discourses on the Method. Descartes writes that if there were machines bearing the image of our bodies and capable of imitating our actions as far as it is morally possible, there would still remain two most certain tests whereby to know that they were not therefore really men. Of these, the first is that they could never use words or other signs arranged in such a manner as is competent to us in order to declare our thoughts to others. The second test is that although such machines might execute many things with equal or perhaps greater perfection than any of us, they would without doubt fail in certain others, from which it could be discovered that they did not in fact act from knowledge, but solely from the disposition of their organs. So Descartes is kind of, proposed the same thing that Turing has. It's kind of like the Descartes version of the Turing tests. It's just that Turing thinks that machines could do this, that machines could hold a conversation. Descartes thinks they couldn't hold a conversation. And moreover, they would eventually give themselves away as machines. And ChatGPT does this, by the way. You can get ChatGPT to hallucinate, and it will give itself away as a machine. You can also learn to spot the kinds of answers it puts together. there are little quirks that it has, which reveal that you are in fact dealing with a machine rather than a human. Now, Turing is a materialist, but he's not focused on the body as a machine like Descartes. He's focused on the machinery of the mind. This might have been, I mean, initially Turing did have some theistic tendencies when he was young, but he had a close childhood friend, and this is also covered in the movie The Imitation Game, a friend named Christopher Morcom, who died from bovine tuberculosis when he was very young. And this really affected Turing. And perhaps, you know, made him a little bit more of a materialist, a little bit more of an atheist. Tula, come here. He's not interested in the machinery of the body. He writes, for example, that it is possible that at some time creating a robot indistinguishable from a human might be done. But even supposing this invention available, we should feel there was little point in trying to make a thinking machine more human by dressing it up in such artificial flesh. What he's more interested in are human intellectual capacities. You know, poetry, chess, science, art. So this is an example of the kind of conversation that Turing is envisioning a person carrying out with a machine. So our interrogator is asking the questions. So our interrogator might say, please write a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge. Count me out on this one. I could never write poetry. You might say, add 34,957 to 70,764. The computer would pause and then give its answer, because if it answered too quickly, it would give itself away. You could ask, do you play chess? Yes. So I have king at k1 and no other pieces. You have only k at k6 and rook at r1. What is your move? What do you play? After 15 seconds, r to r8, mate. This chess notation is weird. It's not how we notate chess games today, but don't worry about that. And remember, this is all based on this sort of living voice style of conversation, which is used to see whether one really understands what they say they do, or whether they're just rattling off things that they've learned by rote, right? So even though Turing doesn't give a specific definition of what he means by thinking, he certainly does seem to implicitly have the following in mind when it comes to what thinking is: the ability to reason domain generally, the ability to express your reasoning, the conclusions of said reasoning, etc., using natural language, and the ability to reason and employ this language non-deterministically or with the appearance of freedom of the will, or as I said in my PhD, to reason originally. You know, like Putnam said, we are probably probabilistic Turing machines, not determined Turing machines. And that's the Turing test. Is it a good test of intelligence? Well, Turing thinks it is. If you cannot tell whether what you are interacting with in a conversational style is a human or a machine, then the test is passed, and we have to say that the machine is thinking. What do you think? Taylor says no. So Taylor might agree with John Searle, who we're going to get to in a moment. Jack finds Searle compelling. Yeah, a lot of people do. I have to admit, since the advent of ChatGPT 3 or 4, I've got a renewed appreciation of Searle's counter argument. And a lot of people agree. Like, I mean, first, let me get this out of the way. I think that John Searle is just awful. You know, his philosopher, he's okay. As a human, kind of, you know, and I don't want to do an ad hominem here thing, but like, you know, we're talking. This guy lost his tenure because he was sexually harassing grad students. Like, I mean, it's just gross. But I kind of do have a renewed appreciation for the Chinese room thought experiment after seeing what ChatGPT does. Deborah says it's like a mimic. In a lot of ways, it's like a mimic. Jack says, I don't know much about the counter arguments to Searle. Well, we'll look at a few in a moment. Taylor says the machine does not think on its own, it thinks with our assistance. The Turing test is just tells us if the machine can camouflage. Yeah, that's kind of what a lot of people who are skeptical of the test as a test of machine intelligence seem to kind of emphasize that point, I think. So you're right to bring it up. Jack Yeager says the Turing test was a good benchmark for development of AI, but it doesn't do much for the philosophical sense for intelligence. Yeah, I agree. So we can actually see if it's a machine or no, how it used only 30 seconds to add. Well, we can do that. A human could do that calculation in under 30 seconds. First of all, if you have a little piece of paper in front of you, you can easily add those two numbers together in under 30 seconds. And there are also lightning calculators. These are humans who can add vast sums in their head very quickly. A lot of them take a lot of training, and they actually have contests to see who's the better calculator. But it is something humans can do. But you would want to instruct the computer to take time in order to not give itself away instantly, because a computer could do that some like that. And some humans could too, but most humans are going to take a little bit of time because they're going to write it down. Yeah, it is uncanny. There are also mathematical savants who have this ability. Some people who are on the autism spectrum or who have some kind of acquired brain injury develop savant skills in mathematics, which is very interesting. And again, that's due to the way their brains are wired. So that's a neural plasticity, neural reuse kind of thing right there. The Turing test would not have invented itself, or something similar could not have created its own existence. That tells me. Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah. But a sophisticated enough machine. Like, here's the thing: you could do this with people. You can argue that people are natural machines, and we ask questions of our own nature. The question is whether an AI could ever do that. I don't think it's in principle out of the question. It's just a matter of whether we're there yet, and we're not. So let's talk about Searle, which again, I'm kind of gross. You know, if Alan Turing is my hero, John Searle is like, be a Turing, don't be a Searle. I guess when it comes to being a good person, be a Turing, don't be a Searle. But John Searle says, you know, where Turing is like, okay, whatever the machine is doing, if it can pass this test, we got to grant that it's thinking. Searle says, no. Computation, information processing is not sufficient for intelligence. And here's his argument. We have a person sitting in a room. They don't understand any Chinese. They're native speakers of English. And outside of the room, we have a group of native Chinese speakers. So they understand it perfectly well. And they pass messages into the room written in Chinese characters. So they might say like, hello, how are you? And write it in Chinese characters, pass it into the room. You're in the room. You don't understand. You don't read the Chinese characters, but you have a rule book. The rule book is like a computer program. And the rule book says, okay, so if you get this string of symbols, you can respond with this string of symbols. So maybe somebody says, hello, how are you? And you're like, okay, I've got this string. So that means I respond with this string, which means I'm well, how are you? You don't know what it means. You don't know what the message you're getting means. You don't know what your reply means. You just have a rule book that says, if you get this string of symbols, reply with this string of symbols. So and you carry on a conversation, barring the time it takes, forget about the time it takes for you to look up the symbols in your book. But you're receiving these messages, you don't know what they say, you find the appropriate response, you don't know what that means, you send it out, you having a conversation with the people outside of the room who do understand Chinese. So the book is a program, right? It's got if-then statements. If this symbol string, then reply with that symbol string. It looks like to the people outside of the room, again, forgetting about the time it takes to look up the responses, the processing time. If we forget about that, it would look to the people outside of the room that whatever's in the room understands Chinese and it's carrying on a conversation in fluent Chinese. But the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese at all. So the person in the room is just manipulating symbols according to rules, just like what the computer does. The person in the room doesn't understand the semantics. They're only manipulating the syntax. They're only manipulating the symbols according to the rules, the syntax. They're completely blind to the semantics or the meaning of the symbols. So what Searle is actually trying to show is that you can have algorithmic, rule-governed information processing, that is computation, and there will be no understanding whatsoever. The person in the room, after all, does not understand the symbols that she's receiving or the symbols that she's sending out to the people outside of the room. Searle says, because in these systems, these Turing machine-like systems, these digital computers, there's no understanding because the semantics are parasitic to the syntax. We assign the meaning. The computer is blind to the meaning. Yeah, it's a pretty good reply. Excuse me for a moment. I think my dog is getting into something she's not supposed to be. What are you doing down here, Toot? Get out of there. Get out of there. Lie down. All right, sorry. The pupper thought it would be a great time to try and eat some garbage. All right, so, yeah, where was I? Right. In these digital computers, these symbol systems, the meaning, the system itself is blind to what the symbols mean. It's true, the life of a pet owner is never dull. Whoa, now you're over here. Come here. Come here, Toots. Come here, baby. Come on. Oh, why don't you stay here where I can keep an eye on you, huh? Huh? Oh, no, you've been eating garbage. Don't, no. Yes, Tula, so I've always called her Toots for short. Huh? Toots? What's going on in that head of yours, huh? What's going on in that head of yours? Okay. Now don't eat any more garbage. So, let's see. I'm trying to get through all of this today. I think we might make it. So, as you've probably gathered, the whole point of the Chinese room argument is to analogize the person in the room and their rule book to a computer that's running a program. So, as I've said, the person in the room that doesn't understand Chinese, she's manipulating the symbols, turning those inputs into outputs using her program, her rule book, and she's successfully communicating in a certain sense with the people outside of the room. But she doesn't understand anything, and neither does the computer. Searle is saying the computers don't understand anything, so they cannot then be intelligent. And if he's right, and there is no genuine understanding going on here, then the Chinese room argument is a pretty powerful objection against the Turing test. What do you all think? I mean, you know what I think. I think that the Turing test is a pretty neat way to operationalize intelligence. it might work as a good test of machine intelligence. It certainly is an excellent thought experiment, but we need to reimagine what it's good for. And I think that what the Turing test is really good for is not testing machine intelligence at all. It's actually good for serving as an experimental vehicle to understand how humans understand thinking machines. That's what I think. You don't have to agree with me. You might think the Turing test is great, or you might think it's dumb, and that the Chinese room argument succeeds. Convinced, agree. With Searle, Taylor, and Thomas, you agree with Searle or with Turing? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so and I think a lot of people are like that. And I have to admit, you know, even though I'm not a fan of Searle the man, but I do definitely have a renewed appreciation of the Chinese room. Especially knowing how, like, look, because I've sit there and chit-chatted with Chat GPT just to see, right? And it's crazy. The first time I used GPT, it was a little weird. I was like, wow, this is really something. But knowing how it works, it's a large language model, so it's essentially just a neural network. Knowing how those things work, like, I can confidently say, like, yeah, what it's doing is not thinking in the way that philosophers and cognitive scientists have typically understood what thinking is. It's not doing that. And we can say that because we know exactly how it works. Well, insofar as we can know how a neural network works. Right? So well, yeah. Yeah, for the is that what you mean, Sohila, with the if something is written in a way that's not in the book? Yeah. Well, for argument's sake, we're assuming that the book is complete. That there's nothing, there's no response that's not in that book. The point is that you can't read the Chinese characters, right? That's the point. But you can successfully respond to the people who are asking you questions. Brianna, it's just following a set of instructions. Well, a Turing machine is what's it the like a typical chatbot is doing that. But ChatGPT is a little different because ChatGPT is a large language model, so it's a neural network, and it actually doesn't work like that. It doesn't feature a program. Like, neural networks are trained, not programmed. But that's something I don't really want to get too far into. Does ChatGPT excuse me, does ChatGPT learn? In a sense, yes, it does. It does learn. What it does is it's an example of what we call machine learning, in fact. Yeah, so like Jack says, it's predicting an appropriate response output after given mass amounts of data. That is exactly right. We give it a training set, and then we correct all of the weights in the network, so that its output gets closer and closer to the desired output that we want. And then once it gets as close as it can, we stop training it and we keep the network architecture the way it is. And then we have our neural network. And neural networks are everywhere. Like, ChatGPT obviously is a very big example, but you know, probably most of the times you're dealing with some kind of machine vision. Like, you know how you have filters on your phone, like Instagram, Snapchat, and they can, or TikTok, and they can put things on your face, like you know, I can put myself on video, and I could put a cat filter on there and be a cat, or a mustache filter. You know, there's any number of filters, right? Those depend on the kind of machine vision that we've achieved because of neural networks. But they're not running on your phone. They're running on some server over on some who knows where, right? It's not happening on your phone. It's happening in the cloud. But yeah, that's basically how they learn. We train them with lots and lots of data, and then we tweak them with different kinds of learning algorithms that alter the architecture of the network until the network produces the desired output. So they're not programmed, they're trained. And Turing anticipated this in Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He kind of ends by saying, like, look, one day we won't even be programming computers. We'll be teaching them like we teach children. And he was not wrong about that. So that's fascinating. So remember, this is a thought experiment, and thought experiments are designed to clarify our thinking, to test our intuitions. Dan Dennett calls them intuition pumps, which I really like. You know, they get the intuitions pumping to help us work out what we actually think about something. Now, Searle is responding specifically to claims about symbolic AI. He's not talking about neural networks or anything like that. Symbolic AI is the kind of AI that is characterized by a Turing machine or a digital computer, where you have symbols that represent information. And a lot of you seem to agree with Searle, and that's fine. But if you disagree, maybe you'll be sympathetic to one of these replies. There's the systems reply, which says that the person in the room, well, sure, maybe they don't understand Chinese, but she's behaving intelligently in as much as she's able to look up the symbols in the rule book and select the appropriate replies. So it's a more basic form of understanding that we can then analyze the room's ability to understand Chinese in terms of. The takeaway is that Searle might be looking in the wrong place for intelligence. He's saying the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, and he's right about that. But maybe we can say the whole system, the room, the person in it, and the rule book understand Chinese. Some of you may be sympathetic to that reply. Another reply is the robot reply. You know, the room doesn't understand Chinese, sure, but that's because the kinds of things that do understand Chinese or English or any other natural language, they're not disembodied cognitive systems that we pass notes in and out of. They're embodied speakers in a world, right? In understanding Chinese involves interacting with other Chinese speakers in a Chinese society where everyone uses the words in the same way, where everyone plays what Wittgenstein would call the same language game, right? So understanding on this reply amounts to grounding the meanings of words and symbols in an actual real world environment with other thinking agents that are all interacting with themselves and with the world in the same kind of way, namely in a way where they are native speakers of Chinese. So if we could shrink down our Chinese room and put it in a robot body that had the right kinds of sensors and effectors, fly it over to Beijing or somewhere, we might find that it behaves quite intelligently. It can order lunch in Chinese. It can have a conversation in Chinese. It could integrate itself within society and be a very productive robot citizen, perhaps, right? Because it would be the right kind of being, an embodied being. Searle would still claim there's no genuine understanding here, but I think that this is a pretty good reply. And I think it is, I think there really is something to it, right? If you know, all this time we've been talking about, at least when it comes to AI, we're dealing with disembodied agents. But we are thinking beings, and we are not disembodied. We are embodied. We're embedded in a world. And because we're embodied and embedded, our cognition is something that extends into the world via the body. And also, to a certain extent, it's something we enact. Perceiving and thinking are active processes that require us to be embodied, embedded, and extended. This is all something that relates to 4E cognition, which I'll type in the chat in case any of you are curious. So we have embodiment, extension, embeddedness, and an action. So that's something that's good to be aware of. That's a very kind of like a hot topic kind of way of describing cognition nowadays, is that cognition is embodied, extended, embedded, and enacted. So Jack likes the robot reply, as do I, Jack, as do I. I think that the robot reply is about as sound as you can get. It's very similar to Stephen Harnad's total Turing test, which he formulates as a reply to Searle. So if you take Searle's Chinese room argument to be a refutation of the Turing test, Stephen Harnad comes along and says, well, okay, yeah, Searle's right about that. But if we had a symbol system in a body that was physically indistinguishable from a person and could interact with the world in the same way a person does, and if it passed that test, the total Turing test, then we'd have to say, yeah, it's thinking. So that's the total Turing test. Well, they have done the Turing test in real life many times. In fact, there's a competition, an annual competition called the Lubner Prize competition, but it's terrible. It's not a real scientific thing. Oh, they have done that too. In fact, there's a clip from a BBC documentary on computers. You can find it on YouTube. Just look up Chinese Room BBC, and you'll see them actually doing it. And there's a guy in the room, and he's like, I don't know what any of this means, but it says I should put this symbol here, and they pass it to the person outside the room who speaks Chinese, and she's like, oh yeah, I can read what this says. I understand this. Sounds like he does too. Like, yeah, it's you can go check that out after class. Thomas says, I don't see how it makes a distinction between speaking and understanding. You can say the robot speaks it, but does it understand under the robot test? Well, to use language in that setting, that would amount to understanding in that kind of Wittgensteinian sense of language games, right? Like to be able to say that I understand what you're saying, like has anyone read the Philosophical Investigations? Maybe not. Okay. So you can go and check this out, but there's a part where Wittgenstein is describing this sort of the slab game. It's called the slab game, where there are two people with a rudimentary language, and they're building a wall, and the guy says slab and points to the slab, and the guy's like, slab, and passes him the slab. That's kind of showing the kind of understanding that the robot would show, not just by speaking it, but by like interacting with other thinking agents in the world. If it could do something like the slab game from the Philosophical Investigations. That's what I mean. Anyway, it's Wittgenstein. It's later Wittgenstein. It's fun. You should read it, but don't think that you're going to get it all on the first pass, because it's kind of esoteric. It's all just kind of, it's his notebooks, basically, that were published after his death by his students. So if it's kind of hard to follow, it's because they're literally just like Wittgenstein being like, oh, I have an idea, I've got to write this down, like, and then they published all that after he died. So, but that's the mind as a thinking machine. I hope I've covered everything. There's a lot more. I could go on about this forever, because this is kind of my area. But next time we'll do causal theoretical functionalism. So for that, you want to look at chapter 6. If you have questions about machine cognition or thinking machines or anything in the meantime, you can email me or or maybe we'll start off with a little bit of Q&A before we look at chapter 6 next time. No, don't do like a high school essay. I assume you mean like a 5-paragraph essay. Definitely don't do the 5-paragraph essay. I think I made this quite clear in the instructions, but like the 5-paragraph essay is really just a teaching tool. So you need to write as many paragraphs as necessary. You need to have a thesis or a research question and an answer to that question, and you need to use the paper to convince the reader that what you're saying is right. So all of this is like I did do the instructional lecture, and I think I cover most of the concerns like that in that lecture. So if you've watched that and you still have questions, let me know. But yeah, what you're doing is basically writing a research paper. Yeah. Yeah, and of course, remember that the proposal is due on Friday at 11:59 p.m. So if you have any questions, send them my way. I'm gonna go find some food, and then I'm gonna be on my email, being freed up from technology by answering emails all night. So I've got some questions about the essays I haven't answered yet. I'll be getting to those. So if you haven't heard back from me yet and you've emailed me, I'll be taking care of that this evening. And if you have questions, send me an email. A report in support of certain theories and denying others. Yeah, but don't frame it like a report. Frame it like an essay. Like it's got to have an argumentative slant to it. That is like absolutely necessary for this assignment. You need to be making an argument. You need to be trying to convince me of a claim or convincing me that you have answered your research question correctly. That is absolutely essential. I cannot emphasize this enough. Like that's very essential for this assignment. So don't do a report. Do an essay. Yeah. And again, I think that my instructional lecture covers everything. So if you haven't seen it, you need to watch it. And if you've watched it, you can always watch it again. Just put it on double speed and have it on in the background, and it covers everything. So, but that's all I really have for today. So let's wrap it up. And send me your emails if you have questions, either about the assignment or about anything we've covered today. And I shall see you all next time. So enjoy the rest of your week. See you all on Monday. Bye, everyone.